is John Christensen. I am the director of the Museum of Culpeper History. We do this program monthly. It doesn't generate a lot of income, but it does help to pay the few utility bills that we have associated with this space. Tonight's speaker is someone who has been with us before, Mr. Jeff Joyce. He is a 20-year Air Force veteran, and over the past several years, he does a lot of volunteering. But over the past several years, he has been volunteering with Culpeper National Cemetery, both with the Wreaths Across America project, but also as a researcher to help illustrate and tell the stories of some of the folks that are interred in the cemetery just behind the building here. But I will turn it over to Jeff.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for those nice words. As John mentioned, I've been here before. About a year ago, I gave a presentation on the history of Culpeper National Cemetery, talking about how it was established after the Civil War and the stories of many of the individuals that are buried there. So earlier this year, when I was talking to Christine at the museum about doing a walking tour at Culpeper, she mentioned that they'd be interested in a presentation in May on Memorial Day, and thought it a good opportunity to come in and share the story. And there are a lot of stories associated with the establishment of Memorial Day, or as we refer to as Decoration Day at that time. So I just wanted to share kind of an overview of the history, how it developed during and after the Civil War, and also mention a few things, upcoming events that are associated with Memorial Day. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get this to go without pointing it at anyone and endangering you. So I entitled it Fallen But Not Forgotten. And again, we think of Memorial Day as the opportunity for us to remember those that have fallen in the service of our country. You know, we also have Veterans Day in November, which really focuses on all individuals that have served. And of course, Armed Forces Day, which is focused in May on individuals that are currently serving in the Armed Forces. But Memorial Day is probably the most emotional of those three days, because it really is supposed to be an opportunity for us to reflect on the service and the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice that many individuals have made in the defense of our country. So here's the topics. I'm just going to go through these very quickly. You know, in the military, they tell them what you're going to say, tell them, and then tell them what you just said. So this is kind of the topics we'll cover. I get some extra points for getting into a little of Greek classics with Pericles, etc. But I thought you can take that home and just scratch your head about that. So, but I'm going to cover the establishment of Decoration Day, as it was called, and then of course how it evolved through World War I and to the national holiday that we think of today, and then a few remembrances in literature I thought would be very appropriate as we go forward over the next several weeks. So, you know, to think about Memorial Day, or as a Decoration Day as they called it at that time, you really have to go back to look at the Civil War, and you know, just how much of a traumatic experience it was for Americans both North and South. You know, you're talking over 700,000 dead, and because of that huge numbers of casualties, for the first time in American history, there was really an effort to bury those, to remember those individuals, to establish national cemeteries. So that huge tragedy really was the emphasis for the national cemeteries like Culpeper, that is just outside the door here, and the remembrance that we now refer to as Memorial Day. So just real quick, as I said, over 700,000 casualties during the Civil War. We don't have firm figures. It's gone up over the last several years due to research, vast majority from disease. You know, more soldiers died of disease, whether typhoid fever or smallpox or pneumonia, than died of combat injuries. And those types of individuals are reflected both combat deaths and disease deaths for those soldiers that are buried at Culpeper National Cemetery. So no identification, like we think of it today, no dog tags per se, unless you purchase something from a sutler. When you were buried either on the battlefield or adjacent to a field hospital using a wooden marker that was available, and those wooden markers often disappeared, which is why even today, even right after the Civil War, about half of the Civil War dead were unidentified and remain unidentified, unknowns, if you will, today. So a couple pictures, just a Union Cemetery down at City Point, which was a major Union camp and supply depot during the siege of Petersburg, and then just a typical Union graves down at Yorktown during the Peninsula Campaign. You can see the wooden markers, how quickly they would disappear just within weeks, months, or even years. So no real way to track the dead on a consistent basis. So, as I mentioned, because of the tragedy of the Civil War, the huge number of deaths, it really, the War Department and the Union decided to make a concerted effort to retrieve those dead and to establish national cemeteries. You know, that whole effort began in July 1862. In Arlington's probably the best known example of that, established in 1864. The first Civil War burials at Arlington were in the spring of 1864, 2 Union soldiers that died. And then by 1872, you know, there were over 70 national cemeteries scattered around the country, covering battlefields from the Eastern Theater through the Midwest, the Western Theater, if you will. Over 300,000 graves had been created by 1872. And as I mentioned, you know, half those were unknown. Half those individuals were unknown. So Culpeper National Cemetery in particular, established in 1867. Why Culpeper? Of course, Culpeper was a crossroads of the Civil War. Much fighting that occurred in this area. You know, you think of Brandy Station, Cedar Mountain, Kelly's Ford. It was a major Union encampment for the Army of the Potomac during the winter of 1863, 1864. So when they established Culpeper National Cemetery in 1867, they reinterred Union dead covering this whole area of northern Virginia, all the way, you know, north of the Rappahannock, all the way down to the Rapidan, east and west. So about 1,355 Union dead were reinterred at Culpeper. And we'll cover a lot of that when on my tour on the 17th of May. And as I said, half of those were effectively unknown. And there's just a good photograph of Culpeper National Cemetery in 1906. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage, why there's national cemeteries, and why that kind of led to the establishment of what was first known as Decoration Day, a way to memorialize and remember the dead, and has evolved over time into Memorial Day. So, you know, even though we think of, you know, decorating graves with flowers as being part of the era of the Civil War, all the way to the modern era, all the way back to ancient times, there were efforts to, you know, remember the dead, both civilian and military. You go back to ancient Greek, ancient Rome, and there were efforts to, you know, to remember the dead. But in terms of the United States in particular, you know, there was no national cemetery network until after the Civil War. You know, most of the dead stayed where they fell, or they were moved to private cemeteries, church cemeteries, etc. But really by the early decades of the 1800s, there was starting to be a move, if you will, an interest, and particularly remembering the Revolutionary War, the forefathers, if you will, the Revolutionary War era, and those dead. This was, you know, during the time frame of the War of 1812, following that the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War. So just out of, you know, kind of interestingly, that as early as 1817, there were writers to newspapers that were looking at ways that they could remember patriot graves. And there's a letter that was written to Philadelphia Magazine, as you see there, in 1817, and they just urging that patriot graves be decorated. So one of the first instances that I'm aware of, though, where there was actually, you know, public interest in kind of having a concerted effort to remember the Revolutionary War dead and decorating their graves. And what's interesting is that magazine, Analectic Magazine, was also the magazine that first published Francis Scott Key's poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, which of course became Star Spangled Banner. So kind of interesting that that magazine was involved in that effort. So certainly by the Civil War, even during the Civil War and in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there were concerted efforts to start to remember the dead, both North and South, and start to decorate those graves. But as you can see, there's a lot of different locations, a lot of individuals that are often pointed to as being the instigator of what is today Memorial Day. You know, the VA recognizes at least 25 places that have been named in connection with the origin of Memorial Day. So not just one or two or three, you're talking at least 24, if not more, instances of individuals wanting to decorate the graves of the fallen during and immediately after the Civil War. And over time, that evolved into Decoration Day and into today's Memorial Day. So let's look at some of those birthplaces, if you will, of Decoration Day. And probably the best known on the southern side the Confederate States is this lady right there, Mary Ann Williams. Well, actually, I should say that even before that, as early as June of 1861, one of the first fallen Confederate officers, John Quincy Marr, who was killed at Fairfax Courthouse. There was a letter written in 1906 at the Richmond Times-Dispatch that referred to an effort to decorate his grave after he fell at Fairfax Courthouse in June of 1861. So that could be one of the, at Warrenton where he was buried, maybe one of the first instances where there was an actual effort to decorate a fallen soldier's grave. But really, it was Mary Ann Williams that is often considered the, not the father, but the mother, if you will, of at least a Southern Decoration Day. She was in Georgia. She was married to a veteran of the Mexican-American War who actually did re-enlist when the Civil War broke out. Unfortunately, her husband died of disease. He had become the commander of Fort Pulaski in Georgia. Came back ill in February of 1862, died soon after, and was buried there in Columbus, Georgia. So, several years later, after the end of the Civil War in March of 1866, Mary Ann Williams, who was actually part of what was called the Ladies Memorial Association of Columbus, kind of trying to protect and maintain the cemeteries there, decided to write an open letter to establish an annual holiday to decorate Confederate graves. And one of the stories is that she and her daughter were visiting the grave of her husband in Columbus, and they were going to put flowers on the grave. And her daughter said, well, why don't we put flowers on some of these other Confederate soldiers' graves in the cemetery? So that is one of the stories of how she got the idea of kind of writing this open letter, which was published in a variety of newspapers in the South, and kind of suggesting or recommending or an annual holiday to decorate Confederate graves. So first observance of what you would think of as the Confederate version of Decoration Day was in April of 1866. Several southern states did that. The dates varied a little, even though April 26th was the recommended day because of delays in the reporting of newspapers, et cetera. The actual observances in several states kind of varied between May and June of that time frame. But that's often considered one of the first organized efforts to decorate soldiers' graves, at least on the southern side. And there's a lithograph there of Confederate graves in Richmond at Hollywood Cemetery, I believe, being decorated in May of 1867. So again, Mary Ann Williams often considered the mother of one of the mothers of Decoration Day. So, but there were other efforts in the South as well. And another well-known effort occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, in May of 1865. Actually, the year before, Miss Williams had recommended the establishment of a Decoration Day, if you will, and it was actually conducted by freed blacks. So in Charleston, South Carolina, on the 1st of May, 1865, they had a parade of thousands of freed blacks, and they had children carrying flowers, and the intent was to decorate over 200 Union graves that were in Charleston at that time. And most of these Union soldiers had died of disease or wounds while being imprisoned at temporary holding areas or hospitals in the Charleston area. There's a photograph showing you the Washington Race Course, which is where those Union soldiers were buried. And those soldiers were later reinterred at Beaufort National Cemetery in South Carolina. And there's a little newspaper article there that, announcing that, that parade and the effort to put flowers on the Union graves. So again, another incident, at least in the South, for decorating graves, though in this case, Union graves. So what about the North? Well, multiple birthplaces, if you will, multiple areas that claim to be the birthplace of Memorial Day in the North, as early as 1864 in Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. Again, records are not really clear. It's not always consistent. But there's soldiers' graves may have been decorated there sometime in June or October of 1864. Again, the records aren't clear. There was some reporting on that. Carbondale, Illinois, in April of 1866. What's interesting is Carbondale was the hometown of General John Logan, who is often considered the father of Decoration Day, and we'll talk about John Logan in just a minute. But really, from a government, congressional, and President LBJ's perspective in 1966, they declared Waterloo, New York, as the birthplace of Memorial Day. And one of the reasons for that is in 1866, they basically shut the city down. So there's actually, reporting where they shut the city down, businesses closed, flags were flown at half-staff. there was a concerted citywide effort on one day to decorate soldiers' graves there at Waterloo. So, again, from a federal perspective, has often been claimed that Waterloo is the birthplace of Decoration Day and actually, or Memorial Day, and there's actually a National Memorial Day Museum. I've never been there before. Hope to visit that someday if I make it up to Waterloo. Be interesting to see how they cover the other aspects of, Decoration Day, Memorial Day, if you will. So, but here's John Logan, Blackjack Logan. He's really, in my perspective, kind of the true father, the instigator of what is known as Decoration Day and certainly Memorial Day today. And why? Well, great biography. He was born in 1826 in Illinois. He was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He was a lawyer, just like his, Abraham Lincoln and many other leading figures at that time. He was a Democrat during that time frame. But when the Civil War broke out, he enlisted in the Union Army. He served throughout the Civil War. He rose to be a corps commander under General Sherman. In fact, when he became the temporary commander of the Army of Tennessee outside of Atlanta, when the prior commander, General McPherson, was killed. So, but he was not a West Pointer. He was a, civilian, if you will. So many of the senior Union soldier generals at that time, whether Sherman or Grant, what have you, typically preferred West Point graduates to be their senior corps commanders. But very effective as a corps commander, and even though he wasn't retained as the commander of the Army of Tennessee, he was highly thought of. And in fact, General Sherman selected him to lead the Western armies through the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. in May of 1865. So, and if you have Washington, D.C., the Logan Square, Logan Circle is named after him. He became, he re-entered politics as a Republican, and then he was the second commander-in-chief of what was called the Grand Army of the Republic. And the Grand Army of the Republic was the Union Veterans Organization, the equivalent of the American Legion, VFW today. Very influential, veterans organization at that time. And so he was the commander of that for 3 years, 1868 to 1871. He was called Blackjack, nicknamed Blackjack, because he had black eyes, black hair, kind of a dark, swazi appearance. But and then he stayed in Washington, D.C., died in 1886, and he's actually buried at the National Cemetery at the Soldiers' Home, where Abraham Lincoln had his summer cottage, if you will, so the National Cemetery there. So why is he considered the father in many respects of Memorial Day or Decoration Day? Well, 1868, May 5th, 1868, he issued a General Order, number 11, to the General Army of the Republic, and he specifically said, well, we're going to, for the purpose of strewing flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country. So this was a nationwide, this order went to all the guard posts around the country and designated May 30th as the day that we're going to decorate the graves of our fallen comrades. And now he's probably likely aware of what had gone on in the South. You remember Mrs. Williams, Sarah Williams, that we talked about earlier, and his wife Mary had actually visited Petersburg, Blandford Cemetery outside of Petersburg, and noticed the flags and flowers on the Confederate graves. And so, plus the other instances in the North, including Carbondale, Illinois, might have all been, in the background of his mind when he decided to issue this General Order in 1868. So this plaque, which has the entire General Order, you'll find that at many national cemeteries, the older national cemeteries that were established in the years after the Civil War. So, and it wasn't intended as one-off. As you read the order, it's really intended to be a recurring effort. Every May, we want to remember our fallen comrades. We want to decorate those graves. So, and so the first Decoration Day actually occurred, official Decoration Day occurred that May 30th, 1868 at Arlington National Cemetery. It was actually adjacent, the ceremony was adjacent to Arlington House. If you go up to Arlington today, you visit the Arlington House, which of course was the home of Robert E. Lee and his wife, Mary Custis Lee. Adjacent to that is what's considered the old amphitheater, which was actually built in the years after the Civil War. Well, in 1868, it didn't exist. They put up a temporary platform there, but by 1873, when they had the annual Decoration Day, and that's actually the old amphitheater there adjacent to Arlington House, that's where they would hold that annual ceremony. And then other states started to pick it up. Again, it was intended to be a GAR-sponsored event, but it became, starting with New York in 1873, it became kind of a statewide effort, statewide holiday, not holiday, but recognition. So New York was the first state in 1873 that recognized what was then referred to as Decoration Day as a recurring effort to, remember fallen Union soldiers. Just a lithograph, a print of a Decoration Day in Philadelphia in 1876. In this case, they're putting flowers on the graves, but flags were flowers were often very common. So you can kind of see the progression, the early efforts north and south in the years during and immediately after the Civil War, and then, of course, General Logan is kind of being the instigator of that annual May 30th event focused on Union soldiers that had fallen in battle, and then picked up by the states over the next couple decades. So what happened after that? Well, continued to grow. By 1890, all the northern states recognized Decoration Day. It was not a national holiday, state-level holiday, if you will, or state-level observance. But by 1891, the Union veterans were starting to age quite a bit, and it was at that point that the Army agreed they would support and organize the ceremonies at the national cemeteries when the GAR or other groups were unable to do that. And that's kind of the point where the Army, which was running, by and large, the national cemeteries at that time, kind of stepped in to continue that effort to place flowers or to recognize the Union dead at that point. In the South, well, again, it was kind of a bit more ad hoc. We saw the initial observance, 1866, in a number of southern states, and it gradually grew, starting with Georgia in 1874, where they started to organize kind of the Confederate equivalent commemoration. Again, the dates varied anywhere from April to June, whereas in the North it was primarily May 30th, which was the date that had been selected by General Logan in his initial general order back in 1868. But it grew. There's a good photograph of cemetery in New York decorated with flowers, and then just a lot of publicity. That's a postcard from 1908. If you will, a lot of posters, postcards, things of that sort. So growing effort and a recurring effort, both on the North and the South. So World War I, World War I was the time frame where it really started to evolve, and from being the traditional Decoration Day, which was focused on Civil War dead, national cemeteries, as well as other cemeteries. And with the American involvement in World War I, the large numbers of casualties, it was at that point, after America's entry in World War I in April 1917, that it really started to be referred to as Memorial Day. There were references to Decoration Day as being, quote, a Memorial Day as early as 1880s, but really the break was, or the real transition from Decoration Day to what we refer to as Memorial Day occurred during World War I, 1917. There's a Memorial Day or Decoration Day parade in New York in 1917, and then of course you can see the various posters there, and again they're referring it to as Memorial Day, not the traditional Decoration Day. Not an official change from Decoration Day to Memorial Day, but just kind of a gradual a change, particularly after World War I. So, what happened after World War I? Well, World War I is where we got into the use of the poppy, the red poppy. We all probably have seen these. The American Legion hands these out around Memorial Day, and it's now considered the symbol of, in the United States, of what is today Memorial Day. If you go over to England, Australia, Canada, the Commonwealth countries, it's the symbol for what's referred to as Remembrance Day, which is the equivalent of our Veterans Day. Remembrance Day, which they commemorate on November 11th, 11th day, 11th month, 11th hour, 11th day, 11th month at the end of World War I, 1918. That's our Veterans Day, but in England, Canada, elsewhere, it's Remembrance Day. And they use the poppy at that point, equivalent to our Memorial Day. So, where do we get the whole idea of using a red poppy? Well, it refers to a very famous poem from 1915 called In Flanders Fields. It was actually composed by a Canadian surgeon, John McCrae. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, and actually I will read the first part of that, if I can get this to pull up. I'll give you a little better idea of what the poem, many of you probably are familiar with the poem. So again, in Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, Short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. So that's where the whole idea of the red poppy being kind of a symbol for the fallen during World War I. And it was actually two ladies, one American, one French, that kind of popularized or are credited with the idea of actually wearing a poppy to remember the dead of World War I. In the United States, it was Moyna Michael. She was a professor in Georgia. She was involved in the YWCA during World War I, and she read Flanders Fields. She read the poem of Flanders Fields. She wrote a companion piece poem related to that, and she was the one that first kind of popularized, at least in the United States, wearing a red poppy to remember the dead on what at that time had evolved from Decoration Day to Memorial Day or Armistice Day in November. So, and in France, it was a woman by the name of Anna Guerin. Again, similar thought, a great way to remember our dead are the poppies, the red poppies that are reflected in the poem by John McCrae. And so it's kind of dual efforts in the United States and in France, and very quickly became quite widespread. In 1920 is the time frame that the American Legion decided to adopt the red poppy as kind of the symbol of Memorial Day, of remembrance, if I should say, not specifically for Memorial Day. Moyna Michael, she died in the 1940s, but there's a stamp that was issued in 1948, again, remembering her as kind of the founder of the memorial poppy, at least on the United States side. And what's interesting here is President Truman getting a poppy. Of course, President Truman was a World War I veteran. He had served in the Army artillery in combat during World War I, and always was very proud of his service during the First World War. And then just a photograph of a typical poppy that we get from the American Legion. And then, as I mentioned, overseas, it's typically worn during Remembrance Day in November, equivalent to our Memorial Day when we wear it in May. So you'll be seeing these available as you all around in the next couple weeks. So how did it become a national holiday? Well, remained kind of known both as Decoration Day and Memorial Day. Both terms were used, though the term had really morphed into Memorial Day during the middle of the 20th century. But it was really 1967. That's when federal law declared Decoration Day was going to be technically Memorial Day, and that it would be moved to the last Monday in May. That was the 1968 Uniform Monday Holiday Act. That's when it technically moved it to the last Monday in May, which took effect in 1971. So I won't go into the whole aspect of victory in World War I Day, et cetera, that's been in the news, but it's Congress that actually declares when there's going to be a national holiday and what national holidays we'll have and when they'll be commemorated. So, and then in 2000, they had a National Moment of Remembrance Act, which called for a moment of silence at 3 p.m. on Memorial Day. So that's kind of the gestation of Memorial Day, starting in the Civil War all the way up to the modern era, if you will. Just a photograph of the Civil War unknowns at Culpeper National Cemetery. There was over 900 unknown soldiers that are buried there, decorated for Memorial Day. And here is the Arlington National Cemetery, 1943. African American graves. Up until 1948, most national cemeteries were segregated. In fact, what is now known as Section D of Culpeper National Cemetery was originally called the colored section. That's where the African American service members were buried, starting in 1941. It wasn't until 1948 that that segregation of the national cemeteries went away in the armed forces. But here's a photograph of two women decorating African American graves at Arlington in 1943, which was at that time segregated as well. So, kind of any questions so far? I kind of gave you a kind of an overview of the history of what is today Memorial Day, beginning really as Decoration Day in the days immediately after the Civil War, all the way up to the modern era of Memorial Day. Before I go into a couple other slides, I want to see if there are any questions so far, any comments. Have anyone else heard of other birthplaces of Memorial Day besides the ones that I have mentioned? And again, this is just a handful of the 25 or so that the VA recognizes. Mike, I don't know if you know of any.
No, Boasberg is the one I usually hear about. Of course, I have a friend from that part of Pennsylvania, so he let me know.
Yeah, I've heard-
They're number one.
Well, Waterloo declares I'm number one.
Exactly.
That's
So
right.
Carl, yeah,
But,
exactly. So.
but in my mind, as I mentioned, I think General Logan is really kind of the true father of Memorial Day, just because of his effort with the Grand Army of the Republic.
If I recall, if I can ask a real quick question, the Confederates moved their decoration date from April to June. Was that to coincide with Jefferson Davis's birthday?
You know, that's a good point. I think it was, but I have to go back and verify that. Again, you notice that initially they were commemorating it various days, starting in April to June, at least initially in 1866. And I think that probably makes sense that it was around the time of that, in June is when they kind of came together and said, this is, from our Confederate perspective, this is the best day. So. All right, so I wanted to throw in a little Greek history for you, so you can go away and say, hey, what I learned from the classics. We all studied the Greek classics in high school, right? No, probably not. Well, anyway, a couple. I just wanted to share these because I thought they were very appropriate, mainly because of the way over time, particularly even all the ancient time, Greek and Roman era, that were efforts to remember and commemorate the dead. And Pericles is a well-known general in Athens, and at that time, in the 400 BC, had special services to honor the dead. Athens had public funerals where they selected a leading citizen to come forward, give a suitable speech. And Pericles, of course, was a Athenian general, politician that had fought in the Peloponnesian War, 1431 BCE. That's when he was asked to give a speech, and his funeral oration. I've not read the whole funeral oration, I have to admit. It's like, has anyone actually read all of Grant's memoirs? So you probably have, Mike, but no, I've read excerpts of it. And you look at what he wrote, and not only are they commemorated by columns and inscriptions, but there dwells also an unwritten memorial of them, graven not on stone, but in the hearts of men. Very similar in some respects to what you would hear from Abraham Lincoln in terms of his Gettysburg Address, second inauguration. A lot of these terms, a lot of these phrases, these ideas date back to antiquity in terms of commemorating the dead and remembering the dead. So now here's your Greek classic lesson for tonight. So Theodore O'Hara. Anyone heard of Theodore O'Hara? All right. Well, if you go into a national cemetery, you have these black tablets called Bivouac of the Dead. He's the one that wrote that poem. And interesting individual. There's a photograph of him. He was actually born in Kentucky, 1820. He served in the Mexican-American War. He was a newspaper editor and poet. So he served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He actually fought at Shiloh, if I recall. And then after the war, he returned. He died in 1867 in Alabama. But what I think of as Bivouac of the Dead was he wrote in the 1850s. He wrote it in 1858. It was published for the first time in 1858. And he wrote it in memory of Kentucky troops that had died at the 1847 Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican-American War. So even though that poem became very popular in the late 1850s and certainly during the Civil War, it was actually written for those that were killed at the Mexican-American War in the 1846-1848. But it was published in 1858. Mobile Register was the first time it was published. Again, as I mentioned, it became quite popular, and it was in the 1880s that the National Cemetery started to install these cast iron tablets with typically the first parts of the first stanza. It's a fairly long poem. I'll just read the whole first stanza. The muffled drum's sad roll has beat, the soldier's last tattoo. No more on life's parade shall meet that brave and fallen few. On fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread, and glory guards with solemn round, bivouac of the dead. And you'll see different parts of that first stanza at the different tablets. And we have one at the historic section at Culpeper National Cemetery. So again, a way to, just in literature, Pericles in ancient Greece, Theodore O'Hara during the Civil War, if you will. What's interesting is, of course, they don't highlight when they put that plaque or that cast iron tablet that the author actually fought on the Confederacy during the Civil War. But it's a very well-known poem and certainly reflective of of individuals' concern about how do we remember the dead during and after the Civil War. All right, now, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Anyone ever heard of Paul Laurence Dunbar? Probably not. Very well-known African-American writer and poet of the late 1800s, early 1900s. I picked him out because, one, very interesting story. He was born in 1872 in Dayton, and his father, an escaped slave, served in the Union Army with the U.S. colored troops. He was the only African-American student at Central High School in Dayton, and one of his classmates was Orville Wright. One of my other volunteer activities is as a docent at the National Air and Space Museum giving tours, and when we reopened the new gallery focused on the Wright brothers and the development of the world's first successful powered airplane, there's a photograph of Paul Dunbar showing his relationship with the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers, before they flew the airplane, they had a bicycle shop, and before they had a bicycle shop, they had a printing press, and they actually had a printing press that they printed. In fact, they printed his newspaper. Paul Dunbar established the first African-American weekly newspaper in Dayton in 1890, and it was actually printed by the Wright brothers printing press. So he's a friend of the Wright brothers. He died early, 1906, died early in Dayton, Ohio. But in 1896, he wrote this ode for Memorial Day. And again, I just have an excerpt of that. I thought it was very appropriate. Again, very similar in some respects to the other poetry that we've looked at in terms of how do you remember the dead. And he specifically refers to, flowers of charity, peace and devotion, blooming in the hearts that are empty of strife. So with singing of paeans and quarrels, and with the flag flashing high in the sun, place on the graves of our heroes the laurels, i.e. the flowers, which their unfaltering valor has won. So just very interesting, I thought, that connection with the Wright brothers, the fact that his father had served in the Union Army with U.S. colored troops. And again, well-known poet, and one of his well-known efforts was his ode for Memorial Day in 1896. And again, you see the reference to Memorial Day versus Decoration Day, even though technically, Memorial Day didn't really become Memorial Day in terms of how it was referred to until really the World War I era. So the references to, Decoration Day being referred to as Memorial Day, as certainly in the years before that. So, yes, ma'am.
He died very young. Do we know why?
Pneumonia. Died of pneumonia. Unfortunately, he had some trouble in his years. I think he became an alcoholic, unfortunately, but he died of pneumonia. So, consumption. So, very young age, unfortunately. Very well known at that time, and even today, well known and respected novelist and poet. Okay, so I wanted to touch upon some of the upcoming events, but any other questions or comments about what I've talked about so far? Okay, all right, so a couple upcoming events. We've got, as John mentioned, I'm going to be leading a tour of Culpeper National Cemetery a week from Saturday. You can sign up here if you've not done so already. Jessica Shimko, who's a staff member at Culpeper, and I will be partnering on that. We're going to focus on the historic section, kind of provide you a history of the establishment of Culpeper National Cemetery and share some of the stories of individuals that are buried there from the Civil War all the way up to the modern era. And most of the individuals we're going to talk about fell in service, either in battle or while they're in the service of the country. So good opportunity. Hopefully, if it's successful, we'll do this on a maybe a semi-annual basis. We'll do one in May for Memorial Day. We'll do a tour in November for Veterans Day. But whether we'll go to the new section versus the historic section, we'll see how it plays out. And then I mentioned the whole effort of putting flowers on graves, which really is how Decoration Day began back in the years during and immediately after the Civil War. Well, there's an organization. I volunteer with Wreaths Across America. Very familiar with that. We put holiday wreaths on the graves every December. Well, there's a companion organization that is called the Memorial Day Flowers, and they're focused on Arlington. And so if you go to Arlington the Saturday before or the Sunday before Memorial Day, which will be that Sunday, you can put flowers. They'll have individuals, volunteers that will hand out flowers you can go and put on graves at Arlington. And also, over the last several years, the Army has allowed individuals to put a grave at the foot of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. They did that for the first time during the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Tomb of the Unknowns. They've started to do it on a regular basis every Memorial Day weekend. So if you're familiar with Arlington and you would like the opportunity, it's great, very humbling opportunity to put a flower at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Please keep that in mind that weekend, that Sunday on the 26th. Sunday the 25th. Memorial Day is the 26th. Arlington opens at 8 a.m. And so, and there's a website, there's the website there. And then finally, here at Culpeper National Cemetery, we'll have our annual Memorial Day ceremony at 11 a.m. Again, 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th year, 11th month for the end of World War I. And that ceremony will be in front of the administration building at Culpeper National Cemetery. So, with that, one last chart. My contact information, if you're interested in learning more about the Culpeper National Cemetery itself, Ms. Parker, Lynette Parker, who's the director there, I'll be happy to share this, forward this presentation to anyone that would like it. I've got, Mike, you convinced me to get business cards.
There you go. No investments.
Yeah, I know. You go to Staples, it's amazing what you can do for a few bucks at Staples. So, but yeah, I'll leave this up if anyone wants to write this down, but I've got some business cards, if you will, with my email, so I'll give those out to anyone that's interested. If you want a copy of this presentation, I'll be more than happy to email it to you, if you will. So, you want to bring the lights up, and then we'll open it up for any further questions or discussion. Okay, so any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Just an FYI, as of May 7th, to drive into Arlington, you have to have a real ID.
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah, and that's mainly impacts individuals that have family passes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're going on a bus or you're walking in, you go through security, but you're right. Or you have a military ID like I do, and I go up through Fort Myer, because parking's a lot easier up there. Of course, you have to walk all the way down that hill, and then you have to hike all the way up that hill to get back to Fort Myer. Yeah, but in that case, yeah, if you have a family pass and you drive in, you definitely need the real ID, just like you would do to board an airliner, go through TSA.
And they close at like, what's that, 5? Yeah, the gift shops closes at 4:30, I forget.
Yeah, Arlington's open every day, 365 days a year, between 8 and 5. Yep. The only time that they don't have any funerals is the day that wreaths are put on the graves, which I believe this year will be December 13th. And I believe Christmas may be the other day that they don't have actually any internments at Arlington. So, all right. Thank you for pointing that out. Any other questions? Any other comments? All right. So, hopefully some of you will be interested in signing up for the tour on the 17th. Mike, I'm using some of the material you sent me, so thank you for that. So, and I'll leave that up in case you want to have those details. So, all right. So, 45 minutes. How about that? As we like to say in the military, I gave you 15 minutes of your precious busy schedule back to you. But so, anything else, Mike? Is there anything that you're going to be doing in the near term?
No, I'm doing some book signings up in Pennsylvania, so I'm going to, for Memorial Day weekend, so I'm going to miss that.
Yeah.
I'm giving some lectures, but no, nothing along these kind of lines.
Okay. Oh, I will say one other thing that I didn't mention here, because is on the in June 7th, will be the annual Descendants Day at Brandy Station's Graffiti House. And that's, an annual event, fundraising activity, but also an opportunity to showcase, the establishment really of the entire park there that includes all of the battlefields, including Brandy Station, Culpeper. But I'll be giving a presentation that day on the 7th of June. I think, Mike, you've already given me some comments on that, so I appreciate that. On kind of the history of the Civil War in Culpeper, think of all of these placards, and I'll put in a couple PowerPoint slides, and then also talk about the establishment of Culpeper National Cemetery and focus on the stories of some of the Civil War soldiers that are buried there, including the one and only Confederate soldier that is buried at Arlington, buried at Culpeper. So if you want to hear that story, you have to either come on my tour or you have to come to the Descendants Day presentation on the 7th of June at Brandy Station. Okay. All right. Anything else? Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your discussion, your questions, and all that. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly enjoyed making this presentation. I always learn something whenever I put this together. It's amazing the kind of research you get and what you learn from putting together a presentation like this. You don't realize what you don't know until you start doing this. So with that, anything else, John, that you wanted to pass on?
Talking about the Culpeper.
Did I set a real low bar or a real high bar?
I'll be talking about the Culpeper Minutemen and really
Okay.
kind of how, not so much the history of the Culpeper Minutemen, but how the memory of the Culpeper Minutemen has been kept alive, really from the Revolutionary War period to the present day. So kind of a little bit of a different perspective than what we usually do. But that will be first Tuesday in June.
All right.
But again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.